Greetings to all you ball Earth skeptics, sphere Earth nutjobs, misinformed general public, overly zealous religious fanatics, the devout science-denying globularists, that is. Hello to the shills, the trolls, the average passers-by, and even say hello to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, if you continue to hold fast to your impossible spherical Earth. Hello to the simply curious souls who happened upon my favorite flat Earth video to date. Just a quick background into why this is my favorite, even as I type the words into the narrative script days or possibly weeks before the video has even been completed, let alone uploaded or viewed. But in spite of all that, it's already my favorite video ever. And I'll tell you why. I'd like to extend an extremely appreciative thank you to all of my supporters, subscribers, and commenters. Many of you have been with me on this astounding revelation of science over the last 5 months or so, as far as I personally am concerned, of course. I really appreciate all of you and apologize to anyone I may have offended in any way. If it seems like I'm neglecting my comment responses, well, to be very honest, I have been. I'm finding it increasingly difficult to keep on top of all the comments, but whenever I have spare time, I do my best to respond to everyone as quickly as possible. Just so you know, if you have questions or disagreements with me, that's fine. I appreciate and respect all that. However, if your first 10 comments on my channel are telling me how stupid I am because we've circumnavigated the globe, just for one example, and cuss me out for no reason, I'm just going to ban you from my channel. I'm not trying to be some type of dictator, but if you cannot make a sensible comment or argument, I encourage everyone to join into the debate. But if you can't make a sensible comment or argument, just keep it to yourself. And of course, there are elements of this discussion who are constantly rattling off the outdated, disproven, heliocentric model because that's what the page shills are there to do. So, in requesting to keep your comments civil and any questions concise and to the point, it would be greatly appreciated. One thing I find extremely frustrating is the 300-line series of questions, 90% of which are already answered if you simply take the time to study the evidence, or at least watch through my Flat Earth playlist, for example, or check out Jaredism, or Mr. Thrive and Survive, or Tiger Dan, or any of the other awesome Flat Earthers out there who are constantly finding new problems with the globe model, which happens to not exist in reality here on the stationary plane we call Earth. At any rate, please keep your comments civil, or you will be banned. The only other option is to disable comments altogether, which to me is unthinkable, but I simply can no longer tolerate my videos being spammed with all sorts of profane nonsense that doesn't add anything to the discussion except confusion or division. We need to discuss these topics as a community of sovereign human beings with brains and integrity, coupled with an unquenchable thirst for absolute truth. Of course, we'll have our differences or disagreements, but there's no reason why we can't keep this civil. I'll mention here that I value each and every one of your input, not just those of you who see the truth and finally agree there's something to this whole stationary plane thing, but I especially appreciate the level-headed people who simply take the time to consider the evidence, make a few typical, expected, easily debunked, half-hearted attempts to prove the globe model, but when given a chance and you simply consider the evidence along with them, and how it relates to the stationary plane model and totally contradicts the world's sphericity, it should at least compel you or compel one to study this topic in greater detail. Let me make one thing clear. I've been a card-carrying globe earther for 99% of my life. 6 months ago, I would have told you that you were exactly an idiot for stating that our world is a stationary plane as opposed to a spinning globe. And that would have been the end of that conversation. Now, I realized that I was simply enacting programming which every single human being in the world has been trained to execute since they were just very small children. I would be mad or naive to expect any normal, rational person to see one or even all of my videos, or read Zetetic Astronomy and automatically, magically become a flat earther. This is not an overnight process, and that is not how deprogramming works. What most people don't understand is that our minds, or our collective conscious, have all been programmed, much like an application in a computer, to execute certain processes and ultimately conform to a specific mode of thinking that allows for certain topics to be obvious and true, while automatically disallows or dismisses other topics or theories as bad data, and is henceforth completely removed from our consideration whatsoever. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about from a point of view of a native South American who witnessed the enormous ships approaching the land from across the sea and eventually overshadowing a good portion of the horizon directly in their face. Surely a magnificent sight to behold, and many of the people apparently didn't even see the ships, since the sight of such a thing was so preposterous according to their paradigm. The enormous seafaring vessel directly in front of their face didn't render in their mind as anything physical of note. This is an important point to make, since what is told to us or asserted to us as being theoretically possible, or conversely theoretically impossible and therefore absurd, with a given worldview which was actually more in tune and more in balance and in harmony with nature than the European invaders, who were certainly more along the lines of psychopathic maniacs such as Columbus, who purportedly slaughtered countless thousands of innocent men, women, and children as if they were dogs in the street. I think Thanksgiving is yet another ritual holiday to commemorate the slaughter, rape, and pillaging of innocent Native Americans, but of course we think it's all about eating turkey birds with Indians. The naive, conventional paradigm that is so nice and pretty, which leads us to even celebrate Columbus Day on the second Monday of October. Those types of holiday dates typically have some connection to specific phases of the moon or astrological configurations, as opposed to, say, Halloween, which is always on October 31st, or Christmas, which always falls upon the winter solstice, and Easter upon the spring equinox. So, the wicked murderer Columbus aside, it's been established that we fully understand going into any conversation or debate with whomever you happen to be explaining this to. Anyone who does believe this the first time you tell them has obviously never been to school a day in their life, or paid zero attention in science class, or never watched the Discovery Channel even once in their life, or they were kicked in the head by a mule, or maybe their science teacher smacked them with something hard. To be very honest with you, I would check a person's head for some type of concussion if, when told, "Hey brah, it's a flat earth," and they simply reply, "Really? Wow, that's amazing. I never considered that. Golly, thanks for pointing that out." As such a person would obviously be completely insane. I'm not disagreeing with that. Any rational person with a good education and a firm belief in the false knowledge passed on to them by the federal education systems, as well as their parents and media, who are all unwillingly disseminating the lie. They're not all lying necessarily. This is not to say that flat earthers are insane. However, it is to say that our entire lives have been psychologically manipulated into deeply believing in a false picture of reality, which is reinforced by the professional manipulators of the collective conscious, or the associations fused with pictures in our mind, which ultimately molds our understanding of the true or not so true place we hold in the grand scheme of things. In other words, the entire world is under a major form of mass hypnosis, totally delusional and completely out of touch with reality. There is a literal matrix of astonishing calculations, all designed to prove the world as a spinning sphere, whilst basing all of their assumed constants or basic mathematical premises on the assumption that the world is a sphere, proving only that they are very good at math. But in terms of understanding physical reality, not so much. With an entire world full of people living within a virtual prison planet, superficial yet extremely potent sphere of influence, a powerful deception that has all sorts of ramifications, both direct and indirect, physical and psychological, including extreme psychological oppression and emotional distress. Our curious and frontiering nature totally capped off at the bottom of a sphere, with no chance of escaping this imaginary, virtual, non-existing prison planet, which only exists in the minds of most people, but is not even close to the world in which we actually indeed dwell within. Constant stress and oppressive psychological constructs, courtesy the modern theoretical physicists, will manifest as physical issues and even ailments, including depression, for one. If a person can come to terms with the fact that they have been completely misled about the very shape and nature of the world in which they dwell, it's an extremely liberating fact to know, and might have extremely positive health effects for people who finally break free of the virtual prison planet Earth. The psychological process a person must go through to firmly believe in a spinning sphere Earth is one that must be done at an early age, as a rational adult would never subscribe to such an asinine, preposterous theory without any proof or further study, while a child will simply accept what is asserted to them by a figure of authority without question, since the adults always know best. The globe lie must be asserted as factual uniformly by all sources of knowledge and influence, whilst any facts or questions contrary to the spinning sphere are instantly dismissed as preposterous. Hence, our society has been trained, like monkeys, to mock, alienate, and throw poop at people who question the validity of the heliocentric model, or purport the world to be obviously a stationary plane, and that the entire population has been fooled. Big time. Understanding this particular truth, while easily verifiable and literally right in front of everyone's face to examine in intimate detail, is a process that must be initiated by the individual, although will never occur in our modern culture without a nudge towards questioning the assumptions involved with the theoretical physics, such as gravity or a sphere Earth. If an intelligent, honest person can be pointed in the right direction, they have a chance at understanding the truth. The initial nudge, as far as I'm concerned, and sincerely appreciate and respect, can be credited to Mr. Matt Powerlin. At any rate, each individual person must be motivated towards in-depth research and consideration of the topic, ultimately to ferret out the truth against all odds, against all conventional so-called wisdom, and must never stop the process until they have gone through every last bit of so-called evidence which supposedly supports the conventional accepted model of the Earth being a spinning sphere. I can guarantee you that every last person who is now a card-carrying flat earther was approached with the topic at some point in their life or another, in one form or another, and they most certainly scoffed at the idea and dismissed it as ridiculous, preposterous, and probably mused about how high-tech our spherical world has become, as the outdated line of thinking associated with a flat earth theory or a horizontal horizon, hearkening back to an era where people were gullible enough to believe if you sailed away too far, you'd fall off into space, for example, or that when you see the masts of ships appear above the horizon before the hole, that somehow proves we live on a sphere, and so we're trained to instantly assume all of these things like a knee-jerk reaction at the speed of thought. All of our training and programming, courtesy the federal school system, leads every last person on this world to react the exact same way when you simply mention the phrase flat earth, even in a very casual conversation with someone you know very well, and even if that person understands that you have a decent level of intelligence, and completely, let's say it's your mother or your brother's girlfriend or, a couple random examples, they completely trust you. So you tell them, did you know that I've recently concluded that our world is a stationary plane and couldn't possibly be a spinning globe like everyone on the world believes? Trust me, this sounds a lot better than, hey bro, it's flat earth, dude. But if you ask a person in such a way that is sensible and seems logically complete, Every single person in the world will react the same way. They will think about what you're saying for an instant, look towards the ceiling in thought for a split second, and then look you in the eye as if you're either stupid or joking or both, and they will begin to laugh, smile, or chuckle at you. Then they will either ask you if you're joking or assert that you're a crazy idiot or some combination of similar reactions. This is the standard, typical, common, never failing to manifest reaction programmed into every last human being on the world during a phase in their life when they believed in goblins and monsters and fairies. The modern power construct has ensured that people are well indoctrinated in globularism. Yes, it's an unofficial religion, but has more followers than all other religions combined, with the key to this religion being the indoctrinating process of the clueless population as early as possible during even our developmental stages. How many parents bought their babies mobiles of the solar system to hang above their crib? I guarantee you it's in the tens of millions. This is fairly compelling evidence that the deception of the globe Earth model can be tracked back to some cross section of our population who literally have their first memory being a compressed image of the solar system hovering around their bed. But isn't it interesting to note that babies are incredibly intelligent, although they are extremely uncoordinated and logically retarded? Babies are super intelligent in the respect that they are constantly soaking in vast amounts of unfamiliar data and over time hashing through these huge terabytes of data stored in the baby's mind for the formative years of their life, which arguably continues for many years beyond the crib. But when you consider the small cross section of the world whose first literal memory they can recollect involves viewing a mobile above their crib, reinforcing the heliocentric model, even then, of course, the baby isn't going to make any rational sense of the mobile, but the constant looming presence of our, quote, solar system etched into the little malleable mind, night after night, day after day, can form a seed of sorts. A seed of an idea which will certainly be presented to the now high school attending baby from the mobile anecdote. Will memories of those formative years, his or her very first memories in this world, being in accordance with what the science teacher is babbling about, our world being an oblate spheroid pronounced at the poles, spinning over 1,000 miles per hour near the equator, racing around the sun every year while the sun races around the galactic center, while the Milky Way flies at 1,000,000 miles an hour, all the while our moon, arguably the slowest body in our neighborhood of the non-existing solar system, must somehow be faster than the Earth, faster than the Sun, and even faster than the very galaxy itself during certain celestial circumstances, making the entire idea of third-generational orbital bodies such as our moon completely ridiculous. They're not even worth considering or rebutting because they are physically impossible, and demonstrably so. People think the world being a stationary plane is some weird, bizarre theory. The irony of this position is astonishing and humorous to me, because the totally nonsensical globe Earth model, which has been spoon-fed to us our entire life, to the entire world, since we were all literally too young to walk or speak, is considered sound and logical by the world at large. However, if you can somehow break the programming and give the topic even a slightly fair or skeptical scrutiny, you will certainly conclude that the world we all live on couldn't possibly be any sort of sphere and is indeed totally stationary. The privately owned military-industrial complex cohorts, or the New World Order controlled and compromised mass media outlets, and many of the so-called alternative media outlets, owned via proxy by the same interlocking worldwide conglomerates and corporations, beyond measurable material wealth, that own all the world banking institutions, including the U.S. Federal Reserve, the World Bank, and even more than likely the very bank where you deposit your paychecks into, they're all one giant conglomerate with the sole purpose of siphoning true wealth away from the people and storing it in vast quantities in order to control everything from institutionalized religion to the institutionalized educational system, governments, military powers, world trade, and media, just to name a few. All of these seemingly unrelated pillars of power and influence in our modern world have a vested interest in keeping the people of the world perpetually stuck in the status quo. Sure, the styles change, the language changes, the quality of the faked footage by NASA gets increasingly believable over the years, the Antarctic Treaty fades ever deeper into the realm of obscurity, the no man's land of our world, which has somehow been removed from our insatiable quest for intricate maps and detailed studies of the untouched regions of the world, while the average person remains focused on the grind, the day-to-day terror that is known as perpetual servitude to debt, and ultimately subservient to the government who was originally supposed to serve the people in a very limited capacity. However, this has all been turned upside down. For all these decades since Operation High Jump and the Antarctic Treaty, how much infrastructure has been built around the outer edge of Antarctica?
Thumbs up to this, gentlemen. The Secretary has approved our plans, confirming you, Admiral Byrd, as the officer in charge of the expedition, and you, Admiral Cruzen, as the task force commander. And we get everything we need. That makes Operation High Jump the greatest polar expedition in history.
Admiral, time is going to be our greatest handicap. By the time we get through this very difficult ice pack, the summer will have ended and the fall will have set in.
Never before has anyone attempted to take a fleet of thin-skinned steel ships through 300 miles or more of crushing ice pack.
I have great faith in your skill, courage, and determination. And now, gentlemen.
Admiral Nimitz reviews the operations plan. The expedition will comprise 3 groups: a central land plane group to explore the interior from Little America, and 2 seaplane groups, the eastern to map that half of the continental shoreline, and the western to map the opposite coast of Antarctica. After the original orders have been issued, 3 months of planning are needed to organize the giant venture.
Then rugged mountain ranges as far as the eye can see. Bunger leans forward in amazement. His eyes have caught a sudden and unbelievable change in scenery. The universal white is turned to chocolate brown, dotted with blue. A cameraman goes into action. 300 square miles of land without snow. Land that might be in New Mexico or Arizona. Pictures alone will prove Bunger has discovered a warm oasis in the shadow of the pole. A warm oasis in the shadow of the pole. A warm oasis in the shadow of the pole. It is for such supreme moments as this that men brave the hardships of exploration. The astounding, undreamed-of fact is that they are over a chain of warm water lakes whose shores, except for small patches, are free of ice and snow. Commander Bunger circles the largest lake in sight, 5 miles long. He comes in to make a landing. Water temperatures must be recorded. Samples taken. He finds the water fresh. The temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit. On the shores are vast deposits of coal and of minerals of the utmost importance to civilization.
Byrd leads his 4 planes in the long climb over pressure ridge areas, heading for the polar plateau, 10,000 feet up. Below are no landing fields, only deep crevasses, pressure ridges 100 feet high, instant destruction for a plane forced down. Byrd pioneered the first South Pole flight in 1929. He applies again the practice of constant vigilance, careful calculations that assured his earlier successes. Over this cruel country, Byrd flies today at 3 miles a minute. In earlier explorations, 3 miles in 1 day was frequently the utmost for Shackleton and Scott for Britain, Amundsen for Norway, and Byrd himself for America. Safe, good going. The greatest exploration flight of all history has ended in success. The flight beyond the South Pole. The flight beyond imagination. The flight beyond imagination. the flight beyond imagination.
Our Western group, flying hundreds of air hours, mapped the 4,000-mile Sunset Coast, made the amazing discovery of warm land in Antarctica.
In all, the expedition explored more than 1.5 million square miles. Our scientists, by use of the radar magnetic detector, have pinpointed fabulous treasures and resources of great significance for all mankind.
The richest and most powerful governments in the world have all been apparently so bad with finances that we've managed to lose essentially all of our currency's value just 100 years since the Federal Reserve Act, magically printing money out of thin air. The Federal Reserve level, which is exactly as federal as kitty cat prostitution ranch in Nevada, where you can pay to have sex with any woman of your choosing legally. It's exactly how federal the Federal Reserve Bank is. Now, I'm not exactly condoning whorehouses. However, the comparison to be made between the Federal Reserve and a legal whorehouse are just too serendipitous to ignore. Whorehouses are legal in Nevada. However, whorehouses are illegal according to federal law. So, in this case, the state law trumps federal law. Being home to the city of the devils probably didn't hurt Nevada's chance with the hierarchy and their minions. The Federal Reserve Bank is illegal according to the Constitution or the pure, unadulterated law of our land. However, the Federal Reserve Bank is now technically legal according to about a dozen secretive whores known as compromised congressmen of the early 1900s, financed and controlled by the richest men of the day, such as the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, as well as our contemporary times, the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, who secretly planned and manipulated the Congress into signing the Federal Reserve Act, still persist. Their bloodlines do, at least to this very day. Their treason included bribing and tricking then-President Woodrow Wilson into allowing for the Federal Reserve Act to pass through the executive branch and ultimately manifest in reality, instantly becoming the bona fide law of the land during Christmas break, when most of the Congress was completely unaware of the emergency meeting held by psychotic Talmudic Freemasons who decided it would behoove them to siphon every possible bit of real worth out of our country as possible by exclusively printing the money supply, loaning it to the government at interest, allowing associated private banks to practice fractional reserve banking, which amounts to creating imaginary wealth out of thin air, somehow turning that imaginary wealth into real wealth, and then foreclosing on a property which you never paid a penny for, and now you own that property because the person whom you loaned the imaginary money to was unable to pay you back with real money or the debt notes of his slavery. Or, in plain English, he didn't have enough cash to pay for the house, so now the bank owns a house for which it simply invented financing for out of thin air, thanks again to the fractional reserve banking scam on the local level amongst members FDIC, and of course the knife in the back of the American people and other nations across the world, known as the financial assassination of a sovereign country by somehow convincing the people that they need a central bank and ultimately allow a situation where the central bank always ends up owning everything because they control the value of the currency. I'm sorry to carry on for so long about finances, but I'm here to tell you that this is the second most important topic of our day, because we can very easily stop this entire dog and pony show known as the status quo by simply refusing to participate in the conventional fiat currency, and simply we, a sovereign people of the world, decide upon our own currency, state by state if necessary, and completely obliterate the notion of any centralized group of private banks and their investors from controlling the purse strings of our once honorable, once awesome, and once God-fearing and ultimately isolationist and Protestant Christian nation that has been stripped of its moral fabric bit by bit, incrementally over time, with increasing magnitude and frequency as the decades roll by, rendering the entire thing a mere shell of its former self. It's worth mentioning that when the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law, secretly under extremely suspect and obviously subversive circumstances, they didn't necessarily publicly launch the thing sounding trumpets to let the Americans know about the new central bank, which was supposed to prevent inflation, but has instead caused the value of our money supply to dwindle to about, well, really nothing, but about 1 to 3% of its original worth prior to the hijacking of our economy by the Rothschild-owned and operated private banks, known as the legal whorehouse called the Federal Reserve Bank, and finally the World Bank, or the City of London, the banking arm of the Illuminati, just as America is the war arm and the Vatican is the religious or satanic arm of the New World Order. All of these citadels, or cities within cities, are their own sovereign nation states. That's Washington, D.C., the Vatican, and the City of London. All of these have been strategically placed throughout the world to perpetuate the Luciferian agenda that has swept our world with a staggering rate over the last 50 or 100 years since the Luciferians decided to reveal their hierarchy or externalize their processes, essentially making every channel on the television a recruiting tool for the satanic agenda. Now, a dollar prior to 1900 is currently worth about 1 to 3 pennies, which means that the Federal Reserve is at best an utter failure, and at worst, they're our very worst domestic enemy, comfortably nestled in the upper echelons of society, and these people need to be dealt with as such, an enemy of our nation residing right here in America at the top of the pyramidal power structure that controls all levers of power and spheres of influence, and of course financing in our secular world. Really, the only difference between a whorehouse and the Federal Reserve is at least the whorehouse only f***s the people who show up and come inside. The Federal Reserve screws everyone but themselves, proverbially speaking, of course. If our military leaders, or even individual members of the free press, had any sort of backbone or fundamental understanding of their true duty as the protectors and watchdogs against corruption or manipulation infecting the American power structures, soldiers are supposed to protect the U.S. from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I submit the Federal Reserve is by far the most destructive enemy the American people have ever faced, and by extension, the world at large faces a similar enemy hidden in plain sight in terms of the World Bank. At least they don't call it the Globe Bank. So there's at least some truth to the World Bank, but I digress. All of our financial and political or corporate systems engineered by inside traders manipulating futures markets to boom and boom and boom, while the majority of people ride high for several decades until the final inevitable bust, which allows the original inside traders and manipulators to cash in on default swaps and hedge funds, just days before the bust. And such a bust will always occur whenever any lie goes on for too long, be it a huge financial lie or a minor white lie, such as, "Don't worry, honey, the giant pimple on the side of your nose will not be in any of the wedding photographs." Okay, so that's a little bit personal, anecdotal example of how any lie will eventually blow back in the face of the liar. A wise thing to consider, especially since it's carved in stone on the Ten Commandments not to bear false witness, and for obvious reasons, least of which is the blowback or bust of the lie finally coming to a head, and oozing pus mixed with blood all over the place in an allegorical sense, of course. We're taught to believe that the world as it is, or the status quo, are all very normal and rational end results to a just and fair series of events. However, the status quo is actually the result of a long series of manipulative men working their backroom deals and manipulating futures markets for their own personal gain at the expense of everyone else. Hollywood movies teach our society that the good guys always win. The good guys typically murder people, often for no reason. America is always the good guys. The CIA is always the good guys. Presidents are always the good guys. And anyone who is not with us must be against us and therefore must be the bad guys.
Either you're with us, either you love freedom and with nations which embrace freedom, or you're with the enemy. There's no in between. You're either with us or you're with the enemy. That's clear. I will continue to make that clear.
The truth is, history is a little bit more complex than that, but more importantly, history is always written by the winners, And so he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. And manipulative psychopaths love to control our minds by setting up boundaries in terms of what is possible and what is preposterous or impossible, without any real study into the topic. Finally, of course, e pluribus unum, or a literal etymological translation of the universe, coupled with the crowning achievement of their patient work in a new world order which starts as a screaming baby, blossoms into a young adult, babysat by Barney and SpongeBob, who then progress to OMDAP, Operation Make Everyone Dumb as Frogger, otherwise known as the universally distributed curriculum laden with thinly veiled as well as blatantly obvious anti-Christian tenets, while promotion of witchcraft and Luciferianism in schools, evolution and Big Bang Theorem are about as anti-Christian as you can get. Or for another example, Harry Potter series, one of the most successful recruiting tools for witchcraft in the occult since the Ouija board. Harry Potter is recommended reading in many districts and is in fact required reading for many middle school districts here in America, where the Bible is a forbidden book, yet a book that is exactly a recruiting tool for witchcraft is not only allowed, but recommended and even required reading. When you realize that witchcraft and Satanism are indeed accredited religions, and the most successful recruiting tool for the occult to date, or Harry Potter, how is it that such totally unconventional and morally repulsive religions, Catholicism certainly notwithstanding, are accepted and promoted in the New Age, even in the schools, as tolerant, attractive, almost completely ignored by the average person who thinks everyone is either a Republican or a Democrat, a Christian or a Muslim, Bud or a Bud Light? At any rate, these tax-free religions of self-worship, secretive and costly initiations, monthly dues, hidden agendas which are inherently beyond the scope of the initiates, polished and presented by highly effective and extremely positive and widespread public relations, no small thanks to their half-innocent and naive neophytes and initiates, and of course the completely subverted and co-opted mass media outlets and many so-called alternative media outlets as well, who will take every chance possible to discredit Christ or mock Christians, incorporate subliminal programming that has hallmark signs of Talmudism and Kabbalism, ultimately plastered across nearly every hour of every channel, of every television, of every day, in almost every home in the world. I find it extremely alarming that rational people who have witnessed world events such as 9/11 and the Apollo missions, just to name two random examples, and they don't think anything is wrong with the fact that the official stories surrounding such events are so full of incomplete logic, asinine conclusions, and outright lies, as well as omissions of critical evidence, skewing and fabricating other evidence, hiring insiders on the government dole to do a so-called independent investigation into the Pentagon crash, for example, or the Twin Towers, or Flight 93, which was obviously shot down by military quick response jet squadrons.
Now, you and the president had earlier discussed rules of engagement for taking down a hijacked airplane, but you were the one who gave the direct order to shoot down a plane that you were told, as it turns out incorrectly, was headed for Washington.
Right. That's correct.
What's that moment like?
Well, it was necessary, and it was frankly, I didn't pause to think about it very much, because once one of those aircraft was hijacked, it was a weapon. We'd seen already, by that time, 3 of them go in to the Pentagon and the World Trade Center in New York. As a result, thousands died, and if we had been in a position to intercept one of those, to keep it from striking its target, would we have done it? Absolutely. And what I did was pass on the President's approval of the basic proposition that we would, in fact, authorize our people to shoot down aircraft that had been hijacked and refused to divert. So I saw it as part of my responsibility, but I did it quickly, because we had a lot of other things we were doing at the same time.
even though NORAD was busy doing fictitious drills of hypothetical planes flying into high-profile targets during war games training exercises on the very morning of 9/11, I submit that once our semi-honorable military leaders decided to eliminate the fourth plane, which was certainly bound for another target, or perhaps it was one of the actual planes full of people which was replaced in flight by a drone and was on its escape to safety when shot down. They would certainly be a loose end, regardless of how well paid they might have been. When it comes to the anti-human greedy mafia that controls U.S. politics and ultimately the military at the very top, it's much easier to simply eliminate a plane full of unsuspecting cohorts, expecting to land in Tahiti with bare-breasted welcome wagons and enormous checks to enjoy for the rest of their life. Why not just shoot the plane down? In any case, and prove to the American people that our military was indeed on point that day, and attempted to present evidence that we got one of four, so that ain't bad. However, the polling data showed that it was much more conducive to their agenda to spin the story about a courageous group of Americans overtaking a couple of dudes with blades the size of a spoon, making emotional cell phone calls which were physically impossible given the contemporary technology during 2001. Cell phones could not get any sort of reception above a certain altitude during that phase of technology, and Flight 93 was indeed well above that altitude when the phone calls were made.
Hey, Kim, thank you. Kim. We told you a moment ago that another plane had crashed in Dayton at the VA hospital.
And we're going to be going back with that soon, but there was a crash first, not to our west. Are we talking about the Pennsylvania crash first? All right, not far to our west, there was another plane crash, hijacked plane crashed in Pennsylvania.
That's in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That's where reporter Dick Russ is. Dick? Well, shortly before 10 a.m., a man locked in the bathroom on board United Flight 93 called an emergency dispatcher yelling the plane had been hijacked. The man also dispatchers the plane was going down after an explosion, and that's exactly what happened. Flight 93 was heading for Camp David, that's what the reports say, a presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland. 45 people were on board that plane. Well, the attacks also put the Akron-Canton Airport at its highest possible security level.
The airport was contacted by the FAA to be prepared to land 6,000 passengers from various airlines.
This sort of proves the entire soap opera about the passengers of Flight 93 overtaking the evil couple of Muslims and still managing to crash the plane directly into the ground, causing the jumbo jet to slam so steeply at an angle into the ground that it traveled in a straight line under the ground, buried itself completely underground, leaving bits and pieces of itself to be found for miles and miles scattered from the crash site, surprisingly coming from the direction of the plane's travel. But no, that plane wasn't shot down. It sunk into the earth, of course. However, even Dick Cheney, I believe it was Dick, he mentioned during a press conference that Flight 93 was shot down, but he sort of backtracked or avoided the point, and we never really heard anything else officially about Flight 93 being shot down over Pennsylvania.
You were the one who gave the direct order to shoot down a plane that you were told, as it turns out incorrectly, was headed for Washington.
Right. That's correct.
Never really heard anything else officially about Flight 93 being shot down over Pennsylvania because the mass media outlets, in conjunction with the FAA and CIA, or really all federal agencies who are subservient to the conglomerate banks who own everything, tricked the entire U.S. population that the airplane crashed into the ground and then disappeared without one single body being discovered, if I'm not mistaken. There may have been some body remnants found scattered over the miles and miles of explosion trajectory from the downed aircraft.
The debris here is spread over a 3 to 4 mile radius, which has now been completely sealed off and is being treated, according to the FBI, as a crime scene. Governor Tom Ridge made some remarks earlier at a press conference. He had flown over the site. He said the emergency response here was immediate. He also said, and I don't know whether or not you all are able to see pictures of this, but this is one of those cases where the pictures really do tell the story, that sort of the most horrifying aspect of this particular crash scene is how little debris is visible. There is a large crater in the ground, and I'm hoping that you all are seeing it as I'm talking about it, but that's really all you see is a large crater in the ground and just tiny, tiny bits of debris. There's been at least one report that the investigators out there, and there are hundreds of them, as I said tonight, have found nothing larger than a phone book.
I want to get quickly to Chris Kanicki. He's a photographer with the Pittsburgh affiliate of Fox affiliate. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago, and Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. We could see some people walking around in the area, but from where we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire, just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet.
But as far as I can remember, they never recovered a single trace of the flight recorders or black boxes of any of the planes destroyed on September 11th, 2001, which is the first 4 times in aviation history with the technologically advanced indestructible black boxes where they were never recovered. So it's worth mentioning that while the official's story claims that the flight recorders were not found, New York City firefighters, including Nicholas DiMazzi, have written books about how they indeed recovered at least 2 or 3 flight recorders from the rubble of Ground Zero in New York.
In prison, or are they in the government in different positions? Are they the suicide bombers or the politicians? Did the Twin Towers fall because the planes hit them, or did they collapse because of controlled demolition? Witnesses heard an explosion blast off. They say they found Satan, now Saquami's passport. 9/11 was catastrophic. How could they find a passport but not find none of the black boxes? 9/11 was catastrophic. How could they find a passport but not find none of the black boxes? 9/11 was catastrophic. How could they find a passport but not find none of the black boxes? Weeks in advance, the owner of the 7th Tower took out an insurance policy for billions of dollars. Why would they let innocent people get devoured so they could step in and play some hero of ours? Good guy, bad guy, they connivers. Now they could take, do, and say what they want.
Nicholas DiMazzi have written books about how they indeed recovered at least 2 or 3 flight recorders from the rubble of Ground Zero in New York, which were ultimately whisked away by the spooks or the men in black, or the unconstitutional, overpaid, thick-headed CIA agents who believe they hold some sort of authority in this world because they carry a specific type of name tag and badge and have been given permission by the official people to kill a suspect or frame a patsy or ultimately know what's best for national security and ultimately smuggle more drugs into the United States than all the mules or sophisticated smugglers combined.
Hadaway's run-in with the DEA would have gone unnoticed, except for an April 1987 broadcast on CBS's West 57th Street called The CIA Connection, Drugs for Guns.
Do you really believe the government decided to get into the drug business in order to pay for the contracts? The American government.
As incredulous as it may sound, I believe that not only decided to get into it, I think they orchestrated the whole thing.
I need more than that. Bring it up a bit. Good. There you go.
These 2 Fort Smith men saw the story and were discussing it in a local bar. An assistant U.S. attorney overheard their conversation and told him his office was working on a case just like that.
He mentioned that their office had a case and that in the process of that they had contacted some people in Florida for some assistance, and that another agency in Florida had contacted their office and told them to drop the case and get off of it.
It bothers me to think that a competent attorney's office could be restrained from doing its job. That's what bothers me.
These men also say the attorney said the case in question involved Barry Seal activities in the Mena area. The Congressional Subcommittee on Crime has now begun its own investigation into the Mena connection. Tomorrow night, we'll show you how a probe into a money laundering scheme in Mena seems to have gone nowhere. The issue of a drug smuggling conspiracy revolves around this convicted drug smuggler, the late Barry Seal. Former SEAL pilots spoke at a grand jury this week about whether their former boss had moved his operation from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to Rich Mountain Aviation in Mena, Arkansas. One pilot who testified told TV5 News Rich Mountain Aviation was simply used by Barry Seal, and Seal didn't involve the company in his drug smuggling activities. But a couple years ago, other witnesses testified at a grand jury about another possible aspect of this conspiracy, money laundering, and nothing happened. Catherine Gann used to work as a secretary for Freddie Hampton of Rich Mountain Aviation. She says she handled lots of cash for her boss, but sometimes in an extraordinary manner.
I was told to deposit the large amounts of cash in amounts of less than $10,000. Even if we had $15,000 or $20,000, I would go to two separate banks and deposit less than $10,000 at one bank and less than $10,000 at another.
What she's talking about is money laundering, or structuring deposits to avoid filling out one of these Internal Revenue Service forms called a currency transaction report.
I asked Fred Hampton why he wanted me to deposit it this way, and he said, IRS won't get this. We won't have to pay taxes on it.
Union Bank of Mena is one of the banks that Kathy Gann was told to deposit large amounts of cash. One Union Bank employee told TV5 News that on one occasion, a former bank official divided the cash for Rich Mountain Aviation and personally went to different tellers and had each of them deposit $10,000 into the Rich Mountain Aviation account. Catherine Gann gave testimony to an IRS agent about the illegal practice, but found that when she appeared before a grand jury, it asked no questions about the money laundering.
When I left there, I was wondering, as I walked down the hall, I wondered, well, why did they bring me up here?
In the meantime, the fact that she gave testimony has caused her to live in fear.
I kept waiting and waiting to hear from somebody, and I was scared all this time. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. And, you know, I knew that his truck had been outside my house. I was scared for my girls.
People close to this issue wonder why such a cut-and-dried case failed to produce indictments. The former Polk County Sheriff has lost faith in the process of justice.
They really do not have a great deal of confidence in the function of the federal criminal justice system at this time.
The deal? The government kept Barry Seal out of jail, and in exchange, Seal became a drug informant and helped put in jail some of his own associates in the international drug trade. But that wasn't all that Barry Seal did. Russell Welch, criminal investigator for the Arkansas State Police.
Did Barry Seal ever say to you, I work for the CIA?
He said he had worked for the CIA.
Unit 5 has learned in the early 1980s, even before his arrest, Seal had bought one of his planes from a CIA front, Air America. The plane was used by Seal for drug smuggling, and the CIA company was paid in the traditional drug dealer fashion of $300,000 in cash. According to this confidential FBI teletype obtained by Unit 5, one of Seal's associates said he was maintaining Seal's aircraft at the Mena airport for the CIA. So what was Barry Seal actually doing?
One federal agent, under very strict confidence, told me that it was assumed within his agency Barry Seal was carrying guns to Central American Exchange, was bringing drugs back on a free ride.
Russell Welch of the Arkansas State Police was one of dozens of investigators who for years had been tracking Barry Seal and his associates. As these documents obtained by Unit 5 indicate, the FBI, the IRS, Customs, and the Attorney General of Louisiana formed just a partial list of those who wanted some answers. They didn't get them. Internal FBI documents indicate investigators were told not to look into any of Seal's activities that occurred before his 1984 plea agreement. So, blocked from seeking indictments against Seal, investigators sought indictments against Seal's associates at the Mena airport for allegedly aiding in the drug smuggling and for alleged IRS violations. So far, no indictments have been produced. At the end of this year, the statute of limitations will run out on those alleged crimes. As for Barry Seal, time ran out in 1986 when he was assassinated in Louisiana by Colombian drug dealers. Some of Seal's secrets died with him, but some of those secrets today remain guarded by the National Security Council, the agency for which Oliver North worked. The NSC has blocked a recent congressional request to examine the relationship of drug smuggling to American foreign policy in Central America.
As a citizen, America didn't get its day in court.
A huge point most people fail to see is that all government bodies are in collusion, just like all mass media outlets are in collusion, as well as the churches, educational and monetary systems. All of these seemingly different assorted groups across the world are ruled from the top down, again like a pyramid of power, with the laymen's or the neophytes or the initiates at the bottom, totally oblivious and entertained or divided in order to control them, while the useless organizations such as the CIA or NASA or the Federal Reserve Bank pillage the rightful wealth of the sovereign American people and most civilized nations as well, and will stop at nothing to continue with the status quo, where they don't need to produce a single thing or perform a single function in society, yet consistently get greater and greater amounts of real property and perpetual slaves, the people. All of our true wealth as a nation traded for a worthless series of green pieces of paper which have mesmerized every living being in our country and decreased in value to the point to where it is essentially totally worthless. Couple that with the fact that every single dollar has a bit of debt attached to it since it was loaned to the government by a private bank at interest, and the government uses the tax revenue of the working class people as collateral for the loan. I gotta tell you, this is the most ridiculous method of managing a nation's currency you could possibly imagine, unless you're one of those people on top collecting the interest on every single dollar ever printed. Then it's working great. But for the rest of us, the 99.9% of us, and that includes every single person watching this video, we've been taken for complete fools. And up to this point, we've deserved every ounce of the financial and industrial beating we've taken over the last 100 years, and I'll tell you why. The founders of our nation, although they were mostly Freemasons, agreed. They knew, however, that the central banks and satanic religious zealots known as the Catholic Church hierarchy would certainly try to creep into positions of power, and so our republic was set up with specific checks and balances to ensure that power was spread out amongst the people and that the government was intended to provide limited services to the people and at the people's convenience and behest. There have certainly been many pivotal points in history, and the signing of the Federal Reserve Act in secret in 1913 was amongst the most profound in terms of long-lasting and ever-expanding pillaging and manipulation of the sovereign, innocent, trusting, if a bit naive people of the world. But that, I submit, is one of the worst pivotal acts of history. To make matters worse, not only does the Federal Reserve simply invent money out of thin air to loan to our government at interest, but every single dollar deposited into an FDIC bank allows the bank to loan out 10 times that amount to private borrowers. In other words, FDIC banks are legally allowed to invent money out of thin air and loan out money that doesn't actually exist, charge you interest on the money that you've borrowed and worked to earn and pay back, which again, the initial capital was created out of thin air, so you just became a slave to the bank. And if you miss the sleight of hand, I'll go over it again. But by accepting and participating in this totally illogical and unsustainable scam, you create a situation where the most worthless element of our society, or the banks, or the government, have literally turned the average working class person into a perpetual debt slave. We all work our butts off to pay back money which never existed in the first place. I know this can be sort of hard to understand at first, but this is how simple it is, and all Americans should be furious. I mean, floored about this. Yet, most people simply ignore the topic because they believe it's another nonsensical conspiracy theory. I'm so tired of that phrase, but we need to bring this topic to the forefront of our generation, along with many, many other topics. Now, I'm going to move away from the modern heist of the entire world, but on a last point on this topic, let's say, hypothetically, a bank has exactly $0 in its vaults. It has zero assets of value and produces exactly nothing of value to return to the community and enhance our society in general. The banks are totally worthless. Well, they're actually one of the most successful distributors of lollipops, but they probably have some backdoor deal with the lollipop manufacturers where they insert some sort of addictive drug into the lollies to keep people coming back to the bank and ensure that the little tots who visit with their mom in the minivan always get a healthy dose upon every visit, ensuring the children will eventually bank there when they become mindless drones, driving around in a daze without a clue as to why they always have an urge to pop into the bank on the way home, even though they have no reason to do so. Maybe it's the lollipops. Okay, so that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but I honestly wouldn't be surprised, nor would I put it past them. Stranger things have been known to happen. Just as a precedent of this point, one of the original secret proprietary ingredients in Coca-Cola was cocaine. You can look that up, it's actually true. So the banking scheme being fairly well caught with this proverbial pants down, yes, they wipe their bums with $100 bills, it's true. But it brings up an extremely significant point and sets an even more compelling precedent. If a small group of men can trick the world into going along with a system that ensures the vast majority of the population does more work for less pay, while a small group of the richest men in the world constantly increase their already vast and limitless wealth on a daily basis, using a series of interlocking, fail-safe, redundant schemes which are totally immoral and unconstitutional, however, are now completely legal because they were simply slipped into one agenda or another, lobbied into existence, and over time, due to their absolute control over the monetary supply, and therefore absolute control over corruptible men, which describes at least 90% of all politicians. Normal, average people do not crave power or prestige. Average people care to raise their family and enjoy their life. This is why, during the era of ancient Greece, the members of the Senate or similar bodies of power, the Athenians used a method called sortition, which essentially picked random citizens to fill certain roles or hold certain seats of power for a limited duration, and I think this was an extremely interesting and wise method to filter psychopaths out of most political systems. I strongly believe that the people who would make the best rulers would never have a lust for power or never have a want to rule. They wouldn't possess a craving to rule over people, and therefore that would make them good rulers. I submit that anyone who tenaciously lusts after power should be automatically disqualified from the position of power they're applying for. I think this should apply for police officers, anyone who chooses a career path that involves invading, attacking, violating, arresting, and ultimately imprisoning complete strangers day in and day out should be automatically disqualified from becoming a police officer.
Video we rarely see Fort Worth police on camera raiding a drug house. But tonight, a family says this video raises questions about the death of a man inside. Police used a taser on Jermaine Darton during that raid last May. He died, records show, of natural causes. But his family says his civil rights were violated. Channel 8's Todd Unger tonight's in the Fort Worth newsroom. He's got more on that. Todd?
John, good evening. Like you said, Darton, the man in question here, well, he does have a criminal past. He even had K2 in his system, according to an autopsy. What he did not have, says his sister, was a chance to live. Like a lot of drug raids, police bust in without a lot of notice. But for the man in the white tank top, things go from bad to worse quickly.
Stop moving!
Fort Worth officers suddenly deployed tasers, striking Jermaine Darton twice, moments after coming in. Here it is from another officer's camera angle.
Even now when I watch it, I break down. because I don't see where there was a reason for him to die.
Darden's sister says the police video shows what their family suspected all along. The man who suffered from asthma was roughed up by officers for no justifiable reason.
He got asthma, man.
At one point, you hear other suspects telling officers Darden has breathing trouble. His family says he has always needed to sit and even sleep at an upright angle, which clearly isn't happening as officers keep him pinned to the ground. But according to 6 inches of police documents associated with the tasing, Darden was, quote, actively resisting officers and, quote, did not show any signs of having an asthma attack. You can see him struggling with police here. There also was a delay in getting paramedics to the scene.
We don't have an active call there.
A MedStar crew stationed only a mile away had to be requested 3 times. During that time, Darden went unresponsive.
He had a right to breathe. He had a right to live. He doesn't have that. That was taken from him.
Police did find drugs at the scene and kids in the house. But Darden's family says despite that evidence, the camera footage itself is evidence there was no need for him to die. Todd Unger, Channel 8 News.
Arresting and ultimately imprisoning complete strangers day in and day out should be automatically disqualified from becoming a police officer. And as far as I'm concerned, you could probably just line that person up against the wall and shoot them. But anyway, the servants of our society have been illegally granted a greater amount of power than they were ever intended to possess, and are likewise incapable of properly utilizing that power, yet are encouraged to abuse their power in many manifestations, up to and including murdering an innocent person. Yet the police officer is often completely excused of all consequences for breaking written and natural laws, which they obviously break on a daily basis, and many police officers have been caught red-handed murdering people, and they got a couple of weeks off with pay, then simply relocated to another district to avoid some, possible public spectacle, like, bumping into the father of the boy that the officer murdered. That probably wouldn't end well. Likewise, in the military, nestled in the tip-top of the PSYOP military program, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who is well known to be the founder of the Luciferian Temple of Set, which is just another Talmudic anti-Christian worshippers of themselves and demons and gay statues or whatever. At any rate, Michael Aquino was accused, I believe multiple times, of acting, let's just say he was acting like a total pedophile and a weirdo when it came to little boys, and allegations of molestation and rape were brought to his superiors. Of course, the military did the swift and strict admirable thing, and they relocated him to a different base where he could continue doing exactly what he was doing before, just in a different town on a different base. In case you were wondering, PSYOPs is a real thing. It's psychological operations. It's a real thing in the U.S. military. And the founder of the Temple of Set, Michael Aquino, who's been accused on multiple occasions of molesting and or fondling little boys, is operating to this day in the U.S. military with a cushy salary and a nice lifelong pension waiting for him. This is just my opinion, but it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if Michael Aquino hasn't murdered at least one innocent little boy in his essentially lifelong career in the U.S. military, completely free to do whatever he wants under the freedom of religion or tolerance built into the military. Well, of course, if you're talking about Satanism or esoteric Kabbalism or Talmudic rites, there's tolerance. But as far as tolerance for Christianity in the military, they're about as tolerant as Leno is to big chin jokes. So that would be extremely intolerant to Christianity. Interesting side note, if I'm not mistaken, Michael Aquino was significantly involved with the true story behind the film with, who was it? I think Clooney or Pitt, I don't know. It was a film called Men Who Stare at Goats. And if I'm not mistaken, Aquino was somehow involved with a project where these soldiers were led to believe they could kill a goat by simply willing it, The validity to the story comes into serious question when Michael Aquino gloats about essentially squandering $20 million for a huge waste of time, and gloats on his blog, The 600 Club. Those pedophiles sure love their clubs, don't they? But I'll quote this esteemed military man who inspired the film The Men Who Stare at Goats, gloating how easy and typical it is for military projects to magically make huge amounts of money disappear. I submit this is the only worthwhile magic trick that weird perverted little boy raper, allegedly, is capable of. So here's the quote from Michael Aquino's 600 Club. Quote, $20 million evaporates every day for far less frisky and fun reasons. Now it all should make for a lively movie to boot. He was speaking of the awful movie with Clooney, which was given all the hype of a blockbuster and was about as entertaining as watching Aquino get his eyebrows waxed, which would certainly be painful, arduous, dangerous operation, to be sure. I mean, that dude has some eyebrows that would make Mr. Spock lose his temper in jealousy. But all these points being made, isn't it amazing that the average people sit in jail for 25 years for merely possessing the wrong type of herb, or making a mistake when they were young, confused, brainwashed child, ignorant of the consequences of their actions, or false accusations in many cases, which led them to become imprisoned for their entire formative and early adult life. One of my very close friends growing up had a cousin who was convicted of first-degree murder back in the 1990s when he was a wild, ignorant, brainwashed, possibly demon-possessed, very troubled soul. He was a bully, to be sure, and it honestly didn't surprise me to learn that he had murdered someone. Although I was friends with him, and he, as everyone else, had redeeming qualities, I think it's important to have strict punishments to fit the crime. Spending 25 years or more in prison for murdering another human being, it was a drug deal gone bad in this situation, but that seems to be, somewhat fair of a punishment, or at least within the ballpark of fair. But to put a person to death for murdering another person only perpetuates murder, as far as I'm concerned, and can often deprive innocent men from living their lives, but can also deprive guilty men from mending their ways and seeking forgiveness and expressing their regrets to the family of the one that they murdered. But to lock up a young, ignorant person for 10 or 20 years for merely possessing or intending to distribute certain chemical or flora substances, is unconstitutional, and I submit that certain elements of our government are importing most, if not all, hardcore drugs like cocaine and heroin into the U.S. via black budget groups such as the CIA and the like. And there's plenty of evidence to back these claims, including the testimonials of insiders like Chip Tatum and intricate mysteries surrounding the Clinton murders in Arkansas. Jumping back right quick to the recruiters of the modern police force, to make matters worse, anyone above average intelligence or particularly sympathetic or attuned to human compassion will summarily be disqualified from enlisting, giving one bogus reason or another, such as overqualified for the position or unsuited for the environment, if they display certain characteristics such as, compassion, intelligence, critical thinking skills, or any degree of distrust or even a questioning of authority or independent critical thought. This is why most of the police officers you will ever encounter are devoid of any semblance of compassion or humanity, as they are specifically selected for their behavioral patterns, which tend to make them act that way, and will very typically be short-tempered, ignorant psychopaths with very little regard for anyone other than themselves, and whom seem to think they actually have some authority over the sovereign population, and are indoctrinated into a system that allows them to totally disregard the rights of the individual, which are guaranteed to us by God himself, and are trained to consider us their inferiors and their enemy. All of these different anecdotes boil down to a single common denominator. Deceptive, manipulative men, psychopaths who possess the cunning, charm, callous, and lack of empathy which can be tested or screened for, they find it very easy to climb their way to the tops of power structures, and the satanic cults or Masonic lodges are no exception to this rule of power-hungry, psychotic men who work together in secret behind closed doors in the upper echelons of their ivory towers, spanning the world as apparently unrelated groups, but with an occult common agenda, always thinking of new schemes to increase their wealth and power at the detriment to the rest of the world. We're in the final stages of a coup d'etat of the American government, and while the rest of the world is certainly aware of the conventional narrative, it is time for the truth to be spread across the minds of all nations, especially the United States. If we can have a total corruption and deception in the military, in the monetary system, in the government, in the educational system, even the food supply, think Monsanto, slick trade deals like NAFTA and CAFTA, domestic corporations shipping their manufacturing efforts overseas because the American tax climate is too volatile, entire cities such as Detroit going completely bankrupt, the American Dental Association tricking the entire world into constantly using sodium fluoride, a neurotoxin, to clean their teeth. Decades of energy crises when diesel engines have had the ability to run on peanut oil or refined fryer grease for literally decades, starting during the World War II era. $3 a gallon gas not that long ago, when Tom Ogle and Stan Meyer used a modified version of the Winnipeg carburetor to run internal combustion engines on water vapor even as early as the 60s. Corporations being set up for the sole purpose of profiting from the imprisonment of the American citizens, unconstitutional laws such as the Patriot Act being signed after 9/11, a never-ending war on terrorism that our black operations teams will ensure never ends, seeing how Osama bin Laden was indeed CIA trained and funded, and was possibly played by Barack Obama on TV years before his, appearance into the world stage, certainly years before his position as president. Just so happens that Obama killed Osama many years later. However, ISIS was also CIA trained and funded, armed as well, and ultimately controlled from the top down in a pyramidal power structure with a compromised figurehead at the top of ISIS with all the money, connections, and clout, allow for organizations such as ISIS to appear to be grassroots movements of fundamentalist Muslims, but are instead co-opted agent provocateurs delving out orders from the top down. Just how they operate. Now, in another example of something similar, the very same government, Obama, these people have been caught red-handed supplying Mexican drug cartels with military equipment and munitions. Take a look at Operation Fast and Furious, not the movie with Vin Diesel, but this same government who staged 9/11, the same government and media who staged Sandy Hook and the Boston bombings, the same government that told us Pearl Harbor was a sneak attack when it absolutely was not, which happened to glean the American support needed for war in Europe during World War II, the same government that tricked us into backing the Vietnam War by using the completely contrived and fallacious event known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which actually never happened. The same government that would have the entire world believe that we're on the brink of nuclear annihilation during the entire 80s if Gorbachev had a bad hair day. The same government who has been keeping thousands and thousands of dirty secrets from the American people for many decades. Every year we find out more and more truths thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. For example, CIA MK-Ultra mind control programs, LSD tests on entire unwitting populations as well as soldiers,